I'm Matt.
And I'm Nate.
And this is Not Quite Religious, a podcast where a Christian pastor and former evangelical turned atheist have conversations about faith, religion, philosophy, and life while drinking coffee.
Welcome to episode 36, where we're going to be delving a little bit more into philosophy and where the next few episodes, foreseeable episodes at this point, are going to veer a little bit. Not to say that we're not going to talk about faith and life and religion, but I think our primary focus from here on out for a little bit is philosophy.
Yeah, I'm excited about that too.
Yeah. I'm going to have to brush up on my political science classes.
It's a hobby of mine. I took a lot of courses. I basically minored when I was in college. I basically minored in mid to late modern Western philosophy. So like Kant to Camus, Derrida, like Rorty.
Yeah. So my third major was political science, and it sounds like it was way less work than it sounds to get 3 degrees at UMass when I was there. So I just want to throw it, I'm not like to get my math degree was 4 extra classes after the physics, and philosophy or political science ended up filling a lot of my gen ed, so I double dipped on a lot of classes. But a lot of my political science classes were / philosophy, so we read Hegel and Marx for our critical theory class, obviously, as well as the German school of critical theorists, and then there was Kant, Derrida, Camus, so the Modern Prince, who's that, Gramsci. So I have Nietzsche. We read a lot of Nietzsche. What's that?
Yeah, and of course Nietzsche.
Yeah. So.
And we'll talk a little bit about him today, but first there is coffee that we're drinking.
There is coffee.
And Nate, you betrayed us.
I got a Dunkin' Donuts today. I started light radiation treatment for my psoriasis, and just in between this and I'm going into the job later today and getting kids to school and being exhausted, I didn't brew my own. And I got I bought new Share coffee, not the type we had, but like another one of their things, just like we've had multiple Mocha Joes. And it's fantastic. But instead I have Dunkin'. It's the Midnight Roast, if that helps.
Oh, what does that mean?
It's their dark roast. They're trying to compete with the Starbucks bolds.
I see. Like when I hear midnight coffee, I'm like those kind of people that when they go on road trips try to drive through the night so they beat traffic.
Right.
Which I just think I don't understand the strategy.
Yeah, the only time we drove through the night in college, 3 times we went to Florida for spring break, and we went to different places each time, but we would drive through the night. But we were 20-year-old college kids, and we would take turns. So it would be go sleep for 4 hours. We'll wake you up at midnight, and then.
Yeah, if I didn't sleep a whole night at my age, at this point, I think I'd be screwed up for half a year.
Yeah, even when Kiera had to go to the hospital, in the middle of the night, I got woken up at 12:30, and I had pretty much, I went to bed at 11:30, so I got an hour of sleep. And then by 6 in the morning, I couldn't even keep my eyes open anymore. Even though it was borderline if what was going to happen to my child, it was just physically impossible.
Yeah.
So.
And the last time I was awake all night when kids were, it was a couple weeks ago. I was sick, so I was awake most of that night. But when you have babies, but my youngest was a baby 5-6 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think there's a big difference between being 35 and 40.
There is yeah. There's I can say it. So Ollie was a newborn when I was 35, and Sebastian was a newborn when I was 40, and it hurt a lot more at 40.
Yeah. Well, I'm drinking coffee that I made, and I didn't blend this time. Does our audience know that we're doing this separate again?
I don't think so.
Probably should say that.
Yeah.
So Nate's at home and I'm at home, so we each well, Nate bought his coffee, but I brewed mine. It's Mocha Joe's Peruvian. It's the second best one.
All right.
It's very chocolate.
So Dunkin' Donuts advertises their midnight as chocolatey as well.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That's usually the dark profile.
Right. Yeah. So I think the other exciting,
and nutty, and
yeah, and
then on the light side, it's fruity and
right,
citrusy.
Yeah, yeah. You just say stone fruit. You say that for wines and for coffees when you don't know what you're talking about. It has hints of stone fruit. Because you can't be wrong, right? If it's a dark roast, you have the plums, and if it's a light roast, you have the apricots, and so yeah.
Who's gonna call you on it?
Yeah, right. So I think the other big news that our audience really cares about is that I have started drinking coffee black and found out that I enjoy it. So
I'm happy about this.
Yeah,
as our audience would know at this point.
Yeah, so it started because of this journey of getting rid of dairy to help my psoriasis, and it's actually most of my psoriasis is cleared up through a series of different medicine, cutting out gluten, dairy, light therapy. So I switched to almond milk creamers and cashew milk creamers, and they were good. They added a little sweetness, but the color was almost still black, right? What I enjoyed about not black coffee essentially was being able to drink heavy cream.
Right.
And it tasted like ice cream and it was delicious. And when you move away from that, it's just I don't care how good your plant-based creamer is. And again, I enjoy some of them. It's just not cream. So about 4 or 5 days ago, I was first off, these almond milk creamers are $5 and they do 3 things. So it almost costs more now to brew at home than it does. So I was let me try it black. And I was hey, that's pretty close to almond milk and I'll save some money and some calories. So I'm black now, man.
Once you go, you never go back.
Yeah. And now I can, Airplane, I can now say I like my coffee like I like my men. So. This episode is not going to age well in 20 years or in 6 months.
Nope. It's not. They're going to posthumously cancel us, which means nothing to either of us.
Yeah.
But yeah, so philosophy.
Yeah.
And before the episode started, we were talking about possibly Nietzsche as a launch pad, which I think is fine.
Yeah, works for me.
And,
well, we were also talking about just you explaining who you're drawn to and your assumption, our a priori assumptions and things like that too.
Yeah, so I tend to be drawn. I tend to have been drawn to existentialism, which is, basically, it is what it sounds like. Sartre was an existentialist. He's actually the one who coined the term for the philosophy, and his big thing was existence precedes essence.
Yeah.
Which is kind of like a roundabout way of saying there's no foundational metaphysics to anything. There's just the raw, bare choice, and that we create our own meaning. But I think that is a brand of existentialism.
Mm-hmm.
It's Sartrean existentialism. The guy that is considered the father of existentialism, Soren Kierkegaard, was actually as much of a theologian as he was a philosopher, and was a devout. Is that the right word? I wouldn't say devout. He was a committed Christian, but he did Christianity his own way, but was very much a confessional, unashamed, unabashed, I'm a Christian. In fact, I think he probably thought that he was the only real one. He was constantly lambasting the Lutheran Church in his day. So it's a little bit ironic that Kierkegaard was considered the father of this movement that became overtly atheist in the 20th century. Pretty much most of the existentialists, Heidegger, in the 20th century, Heidegger, Camus, Sartre, these guys were atheists. Camus called himself an absurdist. That atheism wasn't absurd enough for him, but he's a funny guy. But yeah, I actually hearken all the way back to Kierkegaard as the one who I've always related with the most. Of course, he has his famous/infamous idea of this leap of faith, and has been accused of, probably somewhat fairly, of being a fideist, meaning like just having no room in his worldview for reason, except as a tool to lambast and show the superiority of faith. But I mean, that's a somewhat fair criticism, but as someone who's read a lot of Kierkegaard, whenever you read a lot of anybody, criticisms that sound fair in general, they don't sound fair in the particulars. But anyway, I'm rambling now. The point I was getting to is that existentialism has become something of a catch-all term that's really broad and doesn't describe anything in particular. But I think what those who fall under the umbrella of existentialism, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and the other guys that I mentioned, what they share is this ambivalence towards reason as being able to like complete the circle of truth. At some point, you have to choose. But the thing is like all the guys that I mentioned that fall under that, matrix of existentialism have completely and even like opposing ideas about what those choices constitute and why certain leaps are better than others. So, and I guess I still feel like I'm rambling, but I'll try to make this as short. And I guess what attracted me to it is that I came from a very fundamentalist way of doing theology, which tried to complete the loop of not just reason, but also of revelation, and tried to shoehorn reason into revelation.
Yeah.
Which is an oxymoron if you think about it. And so when I was first reading Kierkegaard, I was just coming out of fundamentalism, and I felt like he was freeing me of, at that point I had realized that like the Bible and rationalism weren't compatible. And so I think that's what launched me into existentialism initially. But it's been 15 years of doing philosophy as a hobby. I have a much more nuanced view now than I did then, obviously. But that's probably good enough. It's a good enough teaser, and hopefully brings some understanding about my perspectives.
Yeah, it's funny that you said you finally figured out that the Christianity, the Bible, and rationality aren't compatible.
Yeah,
because I think that the vast majority of Christian traditions would affirm that from the very. It seems to me it's really Protestant Enlightenment influenced, maybe even more Reformed traditions that want this rationality to support and confirm their faith.
Yeah. Well, at least I would say, at least close the circle is true.
Yeah.
Aquinas was, for instance, and people before him and Augustine were much more friendly to reason than Kierkegaard was. Of course, Kierkegaard lived after the Enlightenment, lived after the Copernican revolution,
right?
Lived after, science. But even before the Enlightenment, Aquinas recognized that there was a limit to reason. He would say something like, reason gets us up to faith, and then faith sort of takes the baton.
Yeah, I guess.
So there's a compatibilism there between reason and faith in Aquinas, but he wouldn't say reason is all we need. Whereas Kierkegaard would say, I'm not even sure we need reason.
Yeah, I guess more what I was thinking along the lines of is like in my systematic theology, when you're reading like Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, there's like a page that says, and Israel slaughtered all the Canaanites. There were no more. And I think it was more the Midianites, the Ammonites. And then the next page, they're like, and then the Ammonites were, and you're like, wait, did they slaughter them all, or were they there? And I feel like a lot of non-reformed Christians are kind of like, it's a mystery, or like it's something different than this hyper-literalist rational.
Right.
Where when you're talking to, at least in my systematic theology, there were like mental gymnastics to make it so that all the Ammonites were slaughtered, and yet there were still Ammonites that, like, sometimes on the same page, depending on the font and how big your Bible page was and how many columns and things like that.
Right. That hyper literalism that is typical of fundamentalism.
Yeah.
Is definitely, I agree. That's inherited from the Enlightenment. That's like Enlightenment rationalism applied to the Bible.
Yeah.
And that is what I discovered was incompatible. At the time, that was earth-shattering for me because I didn't have knowledge of this entire world of theology where there were other perspectives, even within orthodoxy,
right,
that weren't hyper-literal. But at the time, for me, it was like a brick in the wall. The whole wall fell down. It was like, so Kierkegaard was a salvation from that for a time, and that led me, of course, to the other existentialists.
Sure.
But politically speaking, what's fascinating about what just proves the point that I was making about the existentialists being this really broad group and this catch-all term that maybe doesn't even mean anything, is the fact that Sartre was a committed Marxist and would be considered an existentialist, and then Heidegger was, as more research comes out, it seems like more and more like he was just a Nazi. There used to be this thing with Heidegger that it was like, oh, he was sympathetic to the Nazis, and then he realized the error of his ways, and that was mostly coming from his publishers who didn't want people to stop reading his books. But as more and more and more comes out about Heidegger, the more you're like, oh, he was basically a Nazi. And then I'm of the opinion that Nietzsche is also bears some responsibility for Nazism and fascism. So you have Sartre on one hand, who looks at the abyss and the meaninglessness of life and decides the best way to go is Marxism, and then you have a guy like Nietzsche who looks at the same abyss and says the Übermensch is all that matters. And it was only some time before some nut
right,
thought he was the Übermensch.
Yeah. Or multiple nuts, and just one was better at it than others.
Yeah, and even today, I think, could you call it a movement? I don't know, the incel movement or whatever. This rise in fascism. I think a lot of it is based on, I'm not going to say necessarily Nietzschean thought, but a lot of it's based on Nietzschean sentiment of kind of the will to power and strength, and his ideas about cruelty being a virtue. which is like he actually said. You know, it wasn't being ironic.
Yeah.
Like, so existentialism is a broad brush, and I guess part of that broadness is why I'm taking a second look at it. Because if it can lead to anything from fascism to Marxism, it's like, is it even a thing, or is it just a giant, like, penis wagging?
Now we have to mark the episode not safe for work again.
What's that?
I said now we have to mark the episode not safe for work. Great. Yeah, I mean, I think it does potentially go back to, like you said, the existentialists look into the abyss and say, form your own meaning. And so, depending on what your genetic bent is and your upbringing, you know, one person says, well, the meaning is to make sure that everyone has enough. And the other person says, no, the meaning is to rule the world.
Right.
So, and that way, like, I think in the same way that atheism, Christianity, Islam aren't monopoles, like they're a framework to get you somewhere, and they can lead multiple different ways. I think existentialism also isn't a monopole, which I think you also summed up. Yeah. And I think so I just go back. I think all philosophy is probably penis wagging.
I don't know that I would argue that hard against that.
You know, so my journey really, I came into the political science aspect of philosophy. So, you know, read Camus, read Derrida, a lot of Foucault, which I forgot before we were talking. I think I gravitated towards Camus and Foucault quite a bit. We looked at some of the Frankfurt School, and they were so dense and wordy for the sake of being wordy. I don't even know if I fully understand critical theory as they were proposing it, and I don't know if anyone else does either.
I know some Christian pastors that totally get critical theory.
Yeah, I'm sure, and I'm sure they've read the Frankfurt School too, and are the only ones with the proper reading of Hegel and Marx, and you know, so I was drawn to the existentialists when I had like the dark night of the soul, which to borrow a phrase from my Christian days. And then also like I said, Foucault and some of the other postmodernists. And today, like, I don't even know if I read philosophy anymore. I listen to some philosophy of religion podcasts, but I'm much more drawn towards behavioral psychology. So part of what I see is philosophy is like the part of its goal is to provide and define meaning to human existence. And I'm just like, well, there isn't any. So
yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a microcosm of our world, the Western world.
What do you mean? That there isn't meaning?
Yeah. Yeah, and so the concern isn't going to be philosophy.
Yeah.
Concern is going to be ethics and the limitation of suffering and or the will to power.
Yeah, I mean, I'm even more, you know, interested in, like, does free will actually exist? And can we experimentally show that it does or it doesn't? And ironically, going from Calvinism to atheism, almost my entire worldview is intact. Because I don't believe in free will. You know, which I didn't as a Calvinist. I am more rational. The circle needs to close. Like, some would say maybe even hyper rational. I've gotten more comfortable in grays, but I don't really like them. And I think those are like hallmarks of both atheism and Calvinism. They're in some ways they're two sides of the same coin. Just one has a God and one doesn't.
Yeah, that was my observation. I think in the very first episode.
Yeah, I mean, I think the difference would be even as an atheist, I would say that evidence could persuade me. And I think I have a more open mind. Like when I was a Calvinist, before I had unbelief thrust upon me, and I'm going to say it that way, nothing would have changed my mind. And I wouldn't have been open to hearing if Buddhism was true or a different... I would have been interested in hearing if some versions of Christianity, mainly Protestantism, were true. But certainly nothing outside of the Christian worldview. And now, like, if an angel came down and was like, there's a God, you should do it this way, I'd be like, all right, that's pretty strong evidence that I should dismiss my atheism and maybe start reading philosophy again and figure out what this angel deal is.
But, like, if you were truly, I think, like, rational as you ought to be, like, you would probably reach out to your friends and ask them, especially, like, your skeptical friends, and be like, have you had an encounter with an angel, or did I just have a bad pizza? Like, you would want to verify that. But I get what your argument basically is, like, if there were hard evidence, then I would follow it.
Yeah, and I think, like, would have to define what hard evidence is, but like, I'm not so committed to atheism that I would try to explain away some sort of, like... So if I saw an amputee, someone pray over an amputee, and a limb grow back, like, before my eyes, I'd be like, yep, like, what's that guy got? Because that seems like a legit miracle, something that doesn't happen, something that's supernatural. So I should, like, my worldview just got shattered. I need to start believing, if not in deism, but at least in supernaturalism, because that was a supernatural event that occurred.
Yeah. I'm trying to recall, and I think that I'll probably have to save this for the next episode, because I won't be able to recall it. But I think that David Hume makes one of the most devastating arguments against miracles.
In his On Miracles?
I think so.
Yeah.
He talks about, maybe you'll remember it. I'm not going to get into it if you can't remember it, because I won't remember it, and it deserves a full take. But I'll just bring it up in case you do remember it. He has this thing about, like, he leaves town, and while he's away, the entire village is lifted up into the sky, and then falls back down before he comes back. And then he comes back to the island, and everybody's like, David, while you were gone, like, this is what happened. Then he goes around and he has, like, testimony from, like, every single person. And I think at the end of the day, he's still, like, I'll botch the argument, so I won't make it. It's quite nuanced, actually. It's not exactly the same thing as, like, but it's a version of that argument that's as soon as miracles actually happen, then they become physically possible and therefore cease to be miracles.
Yeah, and I'm gonna have to go back to On Miracles. Ironically, one of the podcasts I listened to, they had a panel of Christians, skeptics, and supernaturalists who are not Christians talking about this very thing. And I think basically what they came down to is, like, Hume's argument has been answered, and then other philosophers refined his argument to answer those answers. Like, it's philosophy, right? So you pose something, and someone else is like, wait a minute, here's a hole. And someone else is like, okay, that's true, but we could patch the hole here. And then someone else is like, okay, but there's a smaller hole here. So I don't know who you would make but see, I would, if that was the basic argument, I would have to tend to disagree, which maybe our listeners are going to be like, well, then you should believe the Gospels because they're verifiable and people saw stuff. And I don't want to get into the weeds on that, but, like, if I left Belchertown and the entire town, like all 25,000 people, were like, we were lifted up into the air, like we could see for 3,000 miles, the air was so thin we were getting lightheaded, like we could look down, we were terrified, I'd be like, okay, like, there's something to that. And since it's never happened before, and and it goes against the laws of what we know, and are pretty, like, the theory of relativity and the theory of quantum mechanics are so proven to be almost 100% correct. I'd be like, that's miraculous. Let's, and even if more if it was attached to, say, someone praying and saying, I'm going to talk to insert God here, and they're going to do this to convince you that they are the one true God or the pantheon of gods that are true. I would be like, that's pretty hard evidence. Like, let's look into that.
Yeah.
Where I think there are some hardcore atheists who would be like, nope, not a miracle. Didn't happen.
Yeah. I think I'm kind of surprised by that. Like, sort of, and I don't know that you've surprised me much on this podcast, but
why? I mean, we're like, let's talk philosophy. Yeah, we're not going to talk philosophy at all. Why do you think that would be? Why is that surprising? I guess.
I don't know. I thought, here's a guy that would be familiar, at least with David Hume's arguments. And to me, he's like way, 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 way before his time in terms of sort of anticipating the new atheism. Like if I was a new atheist, I'd be like, David Hume has some holes in his thinking because it was the 1700s,
sure.
But like the basic structure of his worldview. I mean, I think if I was a new atheist, I would be like, that's my boy. You know what I mean? Like, that's our guy. He stands out to me actually among Enlightenment thinkers.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, he was bold enough to be like, this is all BS at a time where that could have gotten you killed in the wrong county.
Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, he wrote on miracles, like knowing he was not far from death, and was asked for it not to be published until after he died.
Yeah, I mean,
he's like, I don't actually want to be a martyr.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, very few people do, I think, outside of extreme fundamentalism, where it's a badge of honor.
I don't know. I think even within like some like extreme asceticism kind of cultures and mysticism, you have people that have sort of a death wish.
Yeah. Fair enough. I mean, going back to the new atheist, though, I think Dawkins is probably an outlier where he would say, absolutely not, no miracles, nothing can convince me. But, as far as I hear Bill Nye debate and Harris and, some of the more prominent anti-theists, I think a lot of them say, like, if there was evidence presented to me that was irrefutable, and they would change their tune. Even Lawrence Krauss, he's like, yeah, like evidence could change my mind, but what I see, and he goes on to say, I really hope there is no God. I wouldn't want to live under a dictatorship, totalitarian universe where there's a creator. So he doesn't want it, but he does concede if there's evidence, whether he wants it or not, he would change his mind. And so I think you would have to pin each one down and say how much evidence, and maybe some of them have such a high bar for what evidence would be that it functionally is, they would never change their mind. But I do think a lot of the new atheists are like, no, evidence could persuade me.
Yeah. Yeah, so I was like all prepared to be like, I bring up Hume and it's going to be like, yeah, Hume. And so you're like, yeah, I don't know about that argument.
I mean, yeah. Like I said, I'll have to go back and find my On Miracles and some of my Hume stuff, which requires me digging through piles of books in the basement. But it feels... The argument is you presented his argument. So let's phrase it that way.
Yeah.
Feels...
I might have botched it.
Yeah, I mean, but... it's also potentially how most people would remember it, right? But anytime you have an argument that from the get-go means that any evidence presented can't change anything, it seems like you've set up the ultimate straw man. It's just like when Reformed Christians tell me that I believe in God in my heart of hearts, and I just hate him or I'm angry at him because Roman 1 says so. I'm like, that's like there's nothing I can now do to progress the conversation and see if we can change each other's minds or come to a better understanding of each other. If Hume's argument is there can be no miracles because once a miracle happens, it's just naturalism. It's sort of like the anti-Romans 1 argument.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. My take on it maybe was different. Maybe not. I'll just verbalize it. So I hear it as like an argument about actually the limits of rationalism. Because Hume was a strict empiricist, and I think empiricists at the end of the day are pragmatic. In other words, like the world of the mind, rationalism, can only really make abstract connections between propositions. Proposition A, you can only at the end be deductive in rationalism. Here's proposition A, this follows, therefore this proposition must be true. And I think what Hume's project is sort of like, well, why not instead of starting with like the Cartesian I think, therefore I am, which is just this abstract thing. What if we just went full on empiricism? Like, reality is what we see.
Yeah.
Reality is what we experience. That's what we know. And we can know more about that than we do now. But up to this point, this is what we know. And in this weird way, I think in order to prove that empiricism was better than rationalism, he would enter into... It was like almost like a satire on rationalism. This is my take. Like he would enter into these rational arguments and show that it's all circular reasoning. That in the end, rationalism doesn't lead anywhere but back to itself. So you could make that same argument about miracles. You could make it backwards and do the same thing to prove like theism.
Yeah.
The point being, why are we still in this world when science has freed us to discover more things about the physical world, which is like where reality really is?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with all of that.
Yeah, I would think.
Right, because I do think rationalism is as circular as deism. In that, right, because one of the arguments I used to get from, and still occasionally when I enter dialogues with Christians in general, and are always brought up in debates, is like, how can you trust rationalism because if it's just in your brain, and how can you have objective morality because it's just made up? And the solution to both of those is like, well, God created rationalism and God created morality, and like that's just as circular. Or they both have like a priori assumptions. Brute facts that like one is there's a God and the other is rationalism can be trusted. Like neither one of those is provable in the sense that 1 + 1 can be proven. They just have to be taken to start, and you can build your worldview from those things. I am not a rationalist because I think behavioral psychology and empiricism has pretty much shown that people are not rational, and economics, modern day economics. Like, the whole theory of economics, and I guess now we can get into Adam Smith as a philosopher too, is that people are rational units that work in their best interest. And it turns out we're not.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I am more of a rationalist or an empiricist. I I can't figure that out yet. I'm still on the journey of trying to figure out what I think about that. So most of my arguments regarding that are always hypothetical, or devil's advocate. But I think that like the fact that people aren't rational doesn't mean that there's not a rational explanation for existence. It just could mean that people choose their passions over their logos.
Yeah, I mean, I would also say they don't choose anything. Like the choice is made for them.
Well, there you go. Yeah, that's going back to your own presupposition, which may precede your empiricism, your determinism.
So I actually think it was the opposite way. I think the empiricism of reading and looking at studies and watching people like Darren Brown and other illusionists and mentalists, and having them like completely convince people that the decisions they made were their own. Even while telling them, like Darren Brown in one of his stage acts is like telling these people who he's manipulating that he's manipulating them. And that they're going to choose option A, even though they don't want to. But he's going to make them choose A. And it's going to be of their own free will that they're going to choose it. And at the end of the whole thing, like they choose option A. And it's like, it's this mind bending where like, he's telling you, I want you to choose A. But you have free will to choose anything else. But I'm going to convince you that A is the right choice. Not through argument and reason. Like he's completely manipulating subconscious. And gets them to choose A. And they're even like smiley shocked that they were right. And it's, I mean, it's a brilliant bit and it's funny and it's engaging. And I wish I knew which one of his stand-ups it was. And like, and another one on his British TV show, he convinces someone that they committed murder. There was no murder. Straight up sets this guy up. And the man goes to the police station and not only confesses that he killed this person, like gives details of how he did it. And all those details came from subtle manipulation of conversations that Darren had with this guy, that other characters he told them what to say, and how he set the house and the stage. Like, absolutely mind-boggling. He convinces an atheist on live TV that there's a God, a father in heaven who loves them, to the point where they're crying, and then he has to come in and shatter them. Which some of my friends are like, that's too far. And maybe it is. It's like he gives this person like this. And so I'm just like, if that's true, like, how's anything free will? If it just takes this little bit of guidance, push, like we're getting prodded and poked all the time. And I mean, even like think about your phone. Like most of those companies have invested a lot of money in figuring out how to get you to click. Right? You're not choosing to click. They're manipulating you to click. So right. It just seems like there is no free will. And I think that came from my empiricism.
Huh. So I guess I would say that there could still be a rational explanation for why there is no free will.
Okay. I can concede that.
But it would be based on not a logical argument, but it would be based on experiential, empirical evidence. And I don't know how we got on free will. It's an interesting topic. Free will versus determinism. I think free will is harder to define than determinism. Because when I think of determinism, I think of a very particular definition. Like you can't. If you're a determinist, you're basically like everything's determined.
Yeah.
Everything's either in the mind of God or it's in the cells, or it couldn't be any other way. Whereas like free will, there's shades of free will, like, right? You can be a free willist and not be an absolute free willist. In other words, you can like be a non-determinist who believes that there's a range, like your will is limited. So technically, if it's limited, it's not free if you want to play language games. But I don't think that's what those free willists are saying. Like, there's people that recognize that the will is limited, but that I think what they just mean is that their choices, that they can make a free choice in the universe.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know anyone who would argue.
In terms of like, yeah. So I wonder, I'm not actually sure. I wonder when it comes to determinism versus free will, where the burden of proof lies. And to me, it just depends on how you define free will.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree that there's, like, I don't think anyone takes the extreme free will thought that, like, me as a human being who does not have a uterus inside of me could grow a baby in my belly and deliver, right? Even if I wanted to, like there's just physical impossibilities. I can't fly without the aid of some other equipment because I'm not an avian, a bat, or an insect. But I would even say, like, so here's the thing, like, I wouldn't even say I'm like a hardcore determinist because I don't think on the physical level, on the tiniest physical level, everything is, and like we know everything isn't determined, right? So quantum mechanics, like, it gives a probability of what will happen, but it can't say this will happen. So in Newtonian physics, you had it's the classic like billiard ball thing. Like if you hit a billiard ball with a certain mass and momentum and angle, the other one has to go this way. It can do nothing else. That's not true in quantum mechanics. Which maybe, so then when you expand, like, I mean, it gets difficult. But I guess all this to say, I'm not like a classic determinist in the way like an Isaac Newton would have been, where God starts it up and nothing else can ever happen. But I wouldn't say that you have the ability to make any sort of choice on your own, that all your choices are thrust upon you, and what you think is a choice, in fact, wasn't, that you could have done nothing else in that situation.
Right. Yeah, and I don't even going back to existence precedes essence.
Yeah.
I don't think Sartre would even disagree with what you're saying. I think the existentialists presumed the death of metaphysics and were interested in ethics more than science. So the conversation that we're having about free will and determinism is very like science-y.
At least the way we're doing it, I guess.
You talked about Newton and determinism, whereas like the existentialists were like, whether or not everything is determined, like every moment I'm conscious of my own existence and my own choosing. So the question is, on what basis do I make a choice? And for what it's worth, that's the existentialist thing. My criticism of that perspective would be I think it's ironic to presume the death of metaphysics and then just move straight to ethics. Because that's the abyss, right? Because the death of metaphysics is the death of morality as we've known it. So then to go to the abyss of like, well, I get to choose my own morality. That's really what they're talking about.
Yeah.
They're not saying like their choices necessarily affect anything physically, or even that there is of physics. It might just be an illusion. Who can explain consciousness, you know? So it's not that like that my choices affect physics. It's just that at the end of the day, there's just me and my choices, which is if that is all you're concerned with philosophically and ethically, it tends to be very egomaniacal. Right? You get to the point where you're like, actually, all there is me and my mind, and I could just be projecting all of reality.
Yeah.
And that all the people I know are just characters in my own mind.
Right.
And you're like, well, then you could rule the world if you wanted to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think
none of the people are real in a physical way.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, there's no way to disprove the Boltzmann brain. Like,
right. But that's why I think, you know, the conflict of now I'm getting into the weeds, man. Like,
and we're coming up against the clock too.
And we're coming up against the clock. Maybe we'll leave this as a cliffhanger. So I just think like the in the 20th century there was the analytic philosophers like Russell and Wittgenstein.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of them versus and the positivists. There's a couple other people I'm forgetting.
You know, there's also the progressives. So you have like Chauncey Wright founding the Metaphysical Club, which is going to lead to James and Dewey.
Yeah. Yeah. Like them, the continental, or I mean the analytic philosophers, which were like Cambridge and Oxford, versus the existentialists like Heidegger and Sartre, who were German and French. So it's my thing is it's this is probably is an original argument to me, but like that analytic versus what was the other term for it? Anyway, there's a term for it. Analytic versus existentialist, I'll just say, philosophy in the 20th century. It's just a holdover from the empiricism versus rationalism of the Enlightenment, where and it ends up holding up geographically too, because the same people who tend towards pragmatism and empiricism and skepticism are like the English and the Irish and the Scottish and
we're
the same people that gravitated towards more analytic, you know, philosophy in the 20th century, where the people that gravitated more towards rationalism, the French and the Germans, were the ones who, you know, were more concerned about ethics in the 20th century than they were, you know, about observable facts, if you will. I'm not doing a great job of explaining it, but there's an enduring conflict between those two ways of approaching things.
Well, and then just to add one more tangent and wrinkle, I think, like I mentioned with James and Dewey, then you have the Americans who are like, it doesn't matter. Let's just do what works.
Yeah, the Americans tended to be even. Yeah.
Right, because like progressivism and utilitarianism come out of America. And like utilitarianism is like, it doesn't matter if it's rational or irrational. If it brings the greatest amount of good to the greatest amount of people, let's do it.
Yeah, which actually goes back to Mill and Bentham, but they were English, right?
And I guess and
like verifies my point.
Yeah, and what's his name? The founder of social Darwinism too, but which came before Darwin, by the way.
Yeah. Well, I'll resist the temptation, urge to continue to wax eloquent or boring, whatever, depending on what fancy is.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm a nerd about this stuff, as people can tell.
Yeah, I think it's an exciting turn, and I'm going to have to brush up on some things and reread some things, but I think there's a lot of room for hefty, hearty dialogue, and even exploring how, like you said, existentialism sort of saved your Christianity, and how I have a little, anyway.
Yeah, and now I'm, it saved my Christianity, but for what, you know? That's where I'm at right now. Like, for what? And is the criticism that existentialism is egomaniacal, like, valid? And if so, to me, that seems pretty problematic.
Aren't all philosophy egomaniacal?
No, not the pragmatic one. But the argument there is, like, once you have a completely pragmatic philosophy, what is philosophy? So I guess I just circularly reasoned back to your point.
I think that's as good a place as any to wrap it up. Any final waxing poetic thoughts?
No, I don't even have anything like sarcastic or pretentiously witty to say.
Well, and I guess we hope you all have a great week, and if you have any philosophers that you want us to read and delve into, and anything that you think we messed up, or feel free to send us a message on Facebook or Instagram or through email. And I want to thank the few of you that have emailed, and I'm really sorry I haven't gotten back to you. If you're still listening to us and didn't feel slighted by me, I will reply as soon as things settle down a little bit.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Nate.